to start addressing the question of the inequities in pharmaceutical education in the Western Pacific region, I'd like to open with two comments. The first is this issue of inequities, and the word inequity implies some degree of unfairness. What I think I need to present to you is the discrepancies or variations that occur across the Western Pacific region. It's not necessarily always a question of fairness, but there's definitely variations and discrepancies that occur that I'd like to highlight. The other point I want to make is, what is the Western Pacific region and the Western Pacific Pharmaceutical Forum, based in that region of which I'm the president? It's a region that covers about a quarter of the world's population, 38 countries and territories. But most notable is that only 16 of these countries and 2 territories have pharmacy associations and pharmacy education facilities. So there in itself is the beginning of the question of inequity. Some of the members and pharmacists in our region do not have direct access to pharmacy education. Now, a couple of other points about this region that are relevant. It's very diverse in terms of culture, land area of the respective countries, from big countries like China to little minute island countries like Numia, for example, or even smaller Nauru. And these countries have incredibly varying populations, from billions of people down to a couple of hundred people, and of course extreme variations in economic wealth and development in health services, including pharmacy and pharmacy education. So let me talk to you about these variations that exist. The first is, as I've just implied, some countries have no in-country pharmacy education because they're too small. And we have to recognise and try to address that. And that is done in the Western Pacific region by a lot of the small island countries supporting would-be pharmacists to attend the pharmacy school that is located in Fiji. It's a good example of regional collaboration. The second variation that occurs in pharmacy education across the region is that some of the pharmacy schools are government schools or public schools, and some are private. And there has been a growth in a number of the countries of private schools in recent years, and they are creating quite a difference, almost a tension in the way pharmacy education is accessible and delivered. There is a different attitude in some countries of the government and the regulators towards the government schools than to the private schools. And they actually have a different level of control applied by the government to them than do the private schools. Third point I'd like to make is in relation to resources. Of course, the level of resource in the country and that they can commit to education is relevant here, and it's the dollars that are available to support the academic programs and the facilities, the research facilities, the teaching laboratories, and it is obviously very variable. Depending upon whether the pharmacy school, the pharmacy faculty, has a research focus and a teaching focus, or purely a teaching focus, is also critical. Obviously, having a research focus can help feed current information into the curriculum, and it can attract academics who have perhaps a greater level of interest in some of these areas of new drug development and the like. So the research base of the pharmacy school is critical, and we generally find that it is the older public pharmacy schools that do more research than in the newer private pharmacy schools. And this is a point about some of these private schools. Education has become a private marketplace, and these private schools are there to obviously attract students, to generate revenue through student fees. And so there's a business aspect to this. It's not purely the place of education and research and academia. It's actually a business. And so that has an implication as well in terms of how much funding is available, and obviously feeding through to issues of how much research is done to support the education and the faculty. The next variation, discrepancy or inequity, as we've termed it, is whether the curriculum is drug focused or clinically focused. Now, we know practice has been emerging very rapidly in all parts of our region, faster in some than others, and particularly fast in hospitals in some parts of our region. And that greater clinical focus of practice can be supported, should be supported by a clinical focus in the undergraduate education. In other countries, there is still a very strong focus on the product, on manufacturing, on distribution, because that's more the core of the role of the pharmacist. So we can call it an inequity or just a variation, but there is a difference in the focus of education from a strong product focus, the more historical nature of pharmacy education, through to a more clinical and therapeutic focus. And of course, that changes the subject matter that is taught in those curricula, whether it's a more historic physical sciences type of course or one with more social sciences content. As we've seen the evolution of some of these pharmacy schools into teaching of therapeutic subjects, they've actually integrated their curriculum. So it's no longer taught as separate streams of pharmacology, medicinal chemistry, pharmaceutics. It's actually an integrated curriculum. And again, there is a distinct difference. And the student that graduates from these two different types of university will consequently have different skill bases and different levels of comfort and knowledge and experience in a clinical setting or otherwise. I then want to look at the other change that has been occurring in education across our region that is different even within individual countries, but definitely different country to country, and that is the level of experiential training that occurs. To what extent does the student get the opportunity to move out of the academic institution, out of the pharmacy school, and spend time in a actual practice setting, be it a community pharmacy, hospital, or manufacturing area, or some other part of practice? Schools are introducing experiential placements more and more, and earlier, but that obviously has an impact on the education that the students receive and consequently creates a difference, a discrepancy, a variation, if you like. Next, I want to actually talk again, a part of the curriculum is this question of to what extent the physical sciences have been retained. I've said that some are moving towards a more integrated curriculum where they don't teach individual disciplines of pharmacology and the like, but some are actually losing those as core elements of the curriculum, and there are issues there. It might suit the education of a student to pass the final exam and to graduate, but the question that arises is to what extent has that student developed core elementary knowledge about base level sciences that might be needed in future education opportunities or to add to their existing education. If you don't have the core building blocks, it can be difficult adding later. What we have seen in some pharmacy schools is the separation, and this is building on what I've just said, of pharmaceutical science from pharmacy practice. And so some students and those colleges and faculty that have separated into pharmaceutical science streams and pharmacy streams will have pharmacists graduating with less knowledge of the core elements of pharmaceutical science. And that will have an implication for their career opportunities later on. Next, I want to actually look at the question of entry level into the pharmacy course. There is quite a variation both within individual countries and across the region of what the entry level into pharmacy is. What the prerequisites are. Some pharmacy schools are building courses that are graduate entry, so the student comes in with an earlier degree in some aspect of biomedical science, and others are post-high school. And until recently, some countries were allowing students to enter university and pharmacy schools including after having only completed 11 years of schooling. So you do have to recognize there is a different entry level for pharmacy students applied by the pharmacy schools, and that feeds through. The more mature the student, the more undergraduate education they have, the more capable they are of taking in the pharmacy curriculum, and the more engaged they can be in the education process. One more point I want to make on this question of discrepancy is the duration of the course. We have witnessed pharmacy programs extending from 3 to 4 to 5 years, plus or minus an internship, and so a massive difference occurring there. We are now witnessing in a couple of countries proposals to reduce the duration. It's become an issue, the long lag time between students entering the program and being able to graduate and complete an internship and get into the workforce. And parts of the profession are looking for a more responsive academia and a shorter education program as part of that, allowing the students to progress at a more rapid rate, partly by removal of breaks between the semesters and vacations, and so it becomes a higher workload. And this is where a graduate entry student is more capable, because they have more experience at learning at this level. So, final point that I'd highlight in this variations and discrepancies is, in fact, the nature of the qualification. Historically, they used to be bachelor's degrees, or for some years they've been bachelor's degrees, but following trends that obviously developed in America, some countries in the Western Pacific region have introduced PharmD degrees. Some have introduced an option of a master's degree as the registering degree. So there's a lot of variation here in the terms that are used. That does not mean that there's equivalent variation in the education program, the caliber of the students, the body of knowledge that they have acquired. Some countries have applied a PharmD term to a program that was very much still a classic Bachelor of Pharmacy program. If you recognize that the PharmD concept as it developed in the United States was closely integrated with experiential placements in work settings, it was aligned with the change in the nature of practice of pharmacists, primarily and initially in hospitals. We are seeing some universities apply the PharmD title to their degrees in some parts of the Western Pacific without necessarily having that integration with practice. So the question arises, is it genuinely a professional doctorate, or is it just a bachelor's degree by another name? So that's a wide range of issues. Some of them are definitely inequities because there's an issue of fairness. Others of them are just discrepancies and variations that do exist across the Western Pacific region. I want to now talk about some of the drivers and the facilitators of the inequities and variations that occur in pharmacy education across the Western Pacific region. And the very first thing that you have to recognize is that national development, the level of economic development in a country, contributes directly to the education resources and consequently the quality of pharmacist education in that country. Smaller countries with low economic development obviously do not have schools, or have schools that are poorly resourced. So one of the drivers is, of course, national economic development, and how that all flows through not just to the education system, but also to the health system, because there is this intimate relationship between the health system and the education of the health professionals, and such as pharmacists, and one drives the other. So a more advancing health system will push the education system to develop better capability and educate better pharmacists. Another difference that exists is the age of the institution. The older pharmacy schools in both the advanced countries and the developing countries have more to call upon. They are wealthier, they have often higher student numbers, which contributes to their revenue and their economy of scale. So the older, larger schools have a capability that the smaller and often private schools do not. So that's a driver. Size is definitely a driver of resource and capacity. It's very hard for a small school to have the full scope of academics, the full scope of types of laboratory, the full scope of resources, information resources and library resources that a wealthier, older, more established and larger school has. I did say that there is this intimate link between education and practice, and so here is another driver that I want to look at. Hospital pharmacy moved significantly globally, and definitely in some of the leading countries, the more advanced countries of the Western Pacific region, as pharmacists moved away from just being involved in the supply process to finding roles in the wards as part of collaborative teams with a focus around the patient. And that forced the pharmacy schools to change the way they were educating pharmacists, to change the subject matter, to integrate the curriculum, to provide the opportunities for interprofessional collaboration in education. So these are all drivers and facilitators for advancement. Another driver is the level of drug development in a country. Now, some countries have quite substantial drug development capability, some have quite substantial drug manufacturing capability, and of course, if a country has substantial drug manufacturing capability and they need pharmacists within those facilities, that influences the nature of the education delivered in the pharmacy schools. They are more likely to be product focused. The academics who are working there have that kind of skill base and are more comfortable teaching product focused, drug focused education than they would be teaching therapeutic, patient focused education. Whereas those countries that may have maybe a lot more drug development or research in clinical practice, clinical trials and the like, needs pharmacists with those skills, and that drives the undergraduate program of study. I did identify in my previous answer how there are variations in the entry level of students into pharmacy schools, and here is another driver. If we have an entry requirement for the student to have already completed an earlier degree, they are more capable as students. Generally, they are older, they have so much more experience at studying at a tertiary level, and they can not only progress through the pharmacy program in a more competent manner, but they actually are achieving better results than students who come in directly from school. So a driver for these variations is, of course, what you set as your entry requirement for your program of study. But that, of course, then influences what you teach in your pharmacy program. I touched briefly on something that's a very important driver, and that's the academic capacity. And that's both the number of academics, but also the experience and the focus, the level of the area of professional comfort of some academics. In those countries that have seen a significant growth in the number of pharmacy schools, there has often been a shortage of academics to fill the necessary posts, or shortage of academics with the necessary level of skill needed. And I did imply previously that a driver is when you actually have academics who have spent their whole career researching and teaching in a particular area, they're going to be less comfortable transitioning and moving with the change in education, responding to change in practice. So academics, who we normally think of as being part of the stimulation of appropriate graduates, can also be a hindrance if they're not contributing the kind of information, if they're not got the expertise that those graduates need for modern practice. Another driver can be workforce issues in the pharmacy profession. Questions of the capability and capacity of the pharmacist workforce and the need for the education facilities to satisfy that demand. Of course, if there is a shortage of pharmacists, it's got a negative impact on healthcare delivery, and there is a driver, a feedback loop that says graduate more pharmacists, take in more students, and that has then an implication on the quality if you do not assure that this increased volume of students going through the university can be accommodated and taught appropriately. Just as a shortage of pharmacists in the workforce can have a feedback loop on the drivers of intake and education, so can an excess number of pharmacists in some settings. If there is an excess number of pharmacists and pharmacists cannot find employment, that feeds back and leads to a reduced number of people applying to enroll. So there's this need to continually balance the supply and demand of pharmacists through the education system and in practice. The trouble is we rarely have appropriate feedback loops that are responsive, and the other issue is, as the undergraduate degrees have extended out to 4 and 5 years, the feedback loop is very slow. If it's taking 5 years for somebody to enter pharmacy school and come out the other end and add to the workforce, then that's a very slow rate of adjustment to any shortage that might be in existence. So I suppose a workforce strategy is an important factor here and can be a very, very important driver to the education of pharmacists. If we do not know the nature of the practice that pharmacists are likely to be working in 5-10 years time, if we do not have some mapping of the number we're likely to need, then the pharmacy schools are really just plodding along based upon historical data, and that's not likely to lead to best outcomes. So a driver of a good education program addressing issues of shortages and the like can be achieved through a workforce strategy that both the education system and practice contributes to. So there's a range of things that are drivers and facilitators, and the next that I will touch on briefly here is the question of quality control through some form of standard setting by an independent objective agency and accreditation against those standards by, again, an independent accreditor. So it's well and good to allow new pharmacy schools to open. I've highlighted the fact that that may well lead to a shortage or inadequate number of appropriately qualified academics. We need standards to be set and for them to be used in assessment of not just the new schools but the older schools, to ensure that they are actually capable of providing the kind of education that a new young graduate will need. I'd like to at this stage address briefly a couple of the barriers to addressing inequities that do occur in education, in looking at the variation that exists, I do want to state that I do believe variation is good. I do like a pluralist society where there are options and choices and variation, because if there is only one choice and if everything is identical, then we risk it being all wrong. Whereas if we've got some variation and choices, we can pick the best of them, and it stimulates the others to lift their game. So accepting that some degree of variation is a good thing, there are some variations that are definitely inequitable, and I just want to touch on a couple of those. We have seen a massive amount of migration, trans-border migration through our region, and we have many different cultural and ethnic groups across the countries of the Western Pacific region, and so we end up with countries with mixed ethnic groups, and some of those ethnic groups have greater hurdles than others, partly because they may well not be able to enjoy the economic benefits of a country as much as perhaps the original inhabitants, and so an ethnic group that came into a country may well be hindered, and that can flow through then not only through their economic status, but also just sort of outright barriers to entry into tertiary education based upon ethnicity. And in some countries that is institutionalized as a way of protecting the interests of the original domestic population, but that creates an inequity for those who are of a different religion, different culture, and that's a problem. The other variation that can be seen as inequitable is the question of access for different genders. Now, we've got some countries in the Western Pacific region where the practice of pharmacy is almost totally feminine. We have other countries quite close by where the practice of pharmacy is almost totally masculine. So there are gender variations. And obviously, there is then consequently a potential inequity for the other gender in those countries. And I do accept and recognise that in the majority of countries, it's actually an inequity for the women, for females. And that in particular seems to apply into some areas of practice and some areas of academia. So getting into ownership of pharmacy, getting into senior positions in hospital pharmacy departments has largely been the domain of males. Getting senior academic positions has often been largely the domain of males, and there's definitely a need to address gender inequity in those circumstances. Two other points that I want to highlight in terms of barriers to addressing inequities and variations, and they are linked. One is the idea, and I did touch on it previously, of some of these newer pharmacy schools as being businesses and not providing adequate levels of resource to the needs of the students, not providing adequate numbers of academic staff, and largely being too small to be a viable economic unit. So that can be a real barrier to addressing equity. But the most important point, and again I did touch on this briefly previously, is the question of setting standards to address that and having independent accreditation of pharmacy schools against nationally recognised and globally aligned standards around pharmacy education, completely aligned with practice. So that's one way of addressing those earlier inequities that I mentioned. You can build into the accreditation standards obligations on the pharmacy schools, the universities, to ensure they are addressing the inequities, those contributors to inequities that might be gender-based or ethnicity-based or the like. want to now speak briefly about a story that has happened, a process that we've been engaged in the Western Pacific Pharmaceutical Forum to try to address the question of standards, of variations, of inequities that occur in education. We conducted, as a regional pharmaceutical forum, a workshop of the leaders of all the pharmacy organisations from the region, the major one from every country, and asked them what are the highest priorities, and created a list of priorities that they would hope WPPF, the Western Pacific Pharmaceutical Forum, could assist with. And the highest priority for them across the region was competency, having some statement of competency that could be used both in the academic area and in practice. And so we took that on and have done a lot of work. We've funded a researcher to examine the competency statements that exist in the countries across the region. And there were not a lot of them. We did some comparisons with the Global Competency Framework, and we developed a broader set of competencies for the Western Pacific region. We have not been adamant. We've created the concept that there's a range of things that countries would be able to choose from depending upon their circumstance, because while there is a global competency framework, ours is broader because we're just addressing the requirements of a particular region. Now, that process led us to identify that there are some countries where the question of competency is treated differently. The expectation of competency is different. And what we have been able to do is to help raise the question or the issue of competency in those countries. But a good example of how it's been able to be taken even further was Mongolia, where there was in the past one government-run pharmacy school, but now there are quite a few privately run pharmacy schools as well. And that government school had established some competency criteria for their education. But that's just for the education of the students going through that school. What about the other schools? What about pharmacists in practice? So the Mongolian Association, Pharmacist Association, have used the guidance that we've developed to work with the limited competency standard that did exist in that country and expand it and develop a broader competency statement. So here, how this helps with the question of inequity is all of the pharmacy schools will be able to use that same standard to ensure their students achieve the common and equal outcome. So there'll be no longer a particular advantage necessarily of one school over another. And that will then ensure all of those students to have equal and fair opportunity in practice. So there's an example of how you can address some of these inequities, and that one was through the question of having common competencies. I've been asked to make a few comments or recommendations to FIP and to the academic institutions in relation to how some of these issues that we've been discussing could be addressed. And not surprisingly, based upon what I've said, a strong recommendation is that FIP could help establish standards for pharmacy education and to ensure that there is an independent model for accrediting pharmacy schools. Now, I do know that there are global accreditation processes that do already exist, but they come at quite a substantial cost, and a lot of the countries where there is the greatest need for assistance are the ones with the least ability to be able to pay significant international accreditation costs. And so we've got to ensure this is something within the reach of the pharmacy schools in the countries of our region. Next thing I want to mention, and this could be facilitated by FIP, but it could be picked up by the pharmacy schools themselves, is to facilitate academic exchange. I can give as an example my own personal experience where through PharmaBridge, some academics from a pharmacy school in the Philippines gained some financial support to come and spend some time with me at the pharmacy school that I have an association with in Melbourne in Australia. The exchange was for 3 weeks. I think it gave them, hopefully, a great insight and has been of benefit to them. I know it was enriching for me Also, and of course my pharmacy school was able, as a more wealthy, substantial school, provide some assistance to those to the funds that they'd received from Pharma Bridge. So we've got to recognise that when you're doing academic exchange, it can be between equals, well and good, but it's going to be particularly valuable if it's an exchange between a developing school, a less resourced school, and a developed school, and you've got to then address the ability to be able to fund that. Look, I can say that academics believe they're well informed about the global situation. They read the international literature, they publish in the international literature, but often that publication has gone through processes of refinement, been through review before it gets into the literature, and so sometimes what ends up in those publications can be a far cry from the day-to-day activities and realities in the workplace. So as much as there's a global interconnection through published literature, it does not mean that there's not some benefit, a real benefit, in academic exchange. The other thing, and it's partly linked to that, is the idea of mentors and mentees, and once you've got some kind of association between two individuals from different settings, it's a great opportunity, and this can be done virtually, to address some of the discrepancies and the inequities that occur. Very hard to change the world to individuals, but every little bit helps. And the lucky last point that I'd make as a recommendation is transnational research. No better way for the academics to understand the circumstance in each other's countries and learn one from the other than by engaging in some form of transnational research. And there are many things that will be a much better research outcome if we can gather data from multiple countries rather than just one country. So transnational research, and I know it does exist, but it exists predominantly between countries of similar development globally, and I would like to see countries of the Western Pacific region identify issues that we have across our region, specific to our region, and ensure transnational research is conducted to address those by the universities and the academic institutions across the countries of our region. Thank you.